A man goes to the doctor and says, "Doc, you gotta check my leg. Just put your ear to my thigh. You'll hear it." The doctor, puzzled, leans in and hears a faint voice. "Hey, man, can you lend me $20? Shocked, the doctor says, "I've never seen or heard anything like this. How long has this been happening? That's not all, Doc. Try my knee." The doctor listens to the man's knee and hears, "Please, I just need $10. Now, completely baffled, the doctor says, "This is unbelievable. Wait, Doc, one more. Check my ankle." The doctor hesitantly puts his ear to the ankle and hears, "Come on, man, just $5. Help me out." The doctor flips through his medical books, shaking his head. "This is bizarre. I don't even know where to start diagnosing this." Then he pauses, thinking, "But based on everything I've heard, your leg is clearly broke in 3 places." A stingy old lawyer diagnosed with a terminal illness was determined to prove the saying wrong. You can't take it with you. After much thought, he came up with a plan. He told his wife, "Withdraw all my money, put it in 2 pillowcases, and leave them in the attic, right above my bed. That way, when I pass, I'll grab them on my way to heaven." She followed his instructions. Weeks after the funeral, while cleaning the attic, she found the 2 pillowcases, untouched and stuffed with cash. Shaking her head, she sighed, "That old fool. I told him he should have had me put the money in the basement." A retired man bought a house near a high school, enjoying a few weeks of peace until the school year began. Every afternoon, a group of rowdy boys marched down his street, joyfully banging on every bin in sight. Day after day, the racket continued until the old man decided it was time to act. One afternoon, he stopped the boys and said, "You kids are great. I used to do the same thing when I was your age, tell you what. I'll give each of you $1 if you promise to come back and bang on these bins every day." The boys, thrilled to get paid for their mischief, eagerly agreed. A week later, the man greeted them again. "Listen, the recession's hitting me hard. I can only afford 50 cents a day now." The boys grumbled, but kept at it. A few days later, he approached them once more. "Bad news. My retirement checks haven't arrived, so I can only pay 25 cents a day. Still good?" The drum leader scoffed. 25 YC. Forget it. We're not banging these bins for pennies. We quit." And with that, the old man enjoyed peace and quiet for the rest of his days. I used to work in a pub next to a hospital when one day a guy walked in wearing a hospital gown, dragging a drip on a stand still hooked up to his veins. I asked how I could help, and he said, "Can I have 2 pints of lager, 2 pints of Guinness, 4 Jack Daniels and Coke, 3 gin and tonics, and 6 shots of tequila?" I figured it's a free country, so I started pouring the drinks, setting them on the bar one by one. He downed each drink in order, finishing with the shots of tequila, knocking them back one after the other. After a moment, he looked up at me, sad, and said, "I shouldn't have drunk all that with what I've got." I asked, "What do you mean? What have you got?" He sighed and said, "About 3 pounds 50 pence. A shy guy walks into a pub and spots a beautiful woman sitting at the bar. After an hour of working up the courage, he finally approaches her and asks, Would you mind if I chatted with you for a while?" Without hesitation, she yells at the top of her lungs, "No! I will not sleep with you!" The entire bar turns to look at them. The guy, mortified, quickly retreats to his table. A few minutes later, the woman walks over, apologizing. She smiles and says, "I'm really sorry if I embarrassed you. I'm a psychology student, and I'm studying how people react in embarrassing situations." The guy looks up at her, then yells back, "What do you mean, 800 pounds? A Texan walks into a pub in Ireland and clears his throat to get the attention of the crowd. He says, "I hear you Irish are a bunch of hard drinkers. I'll give $500 to anyone who can drink 10 pints of Guinness back to back." The room falls silent, and no one takes him up on the offer. In fact, one man even leaves. 30 minutes later, the same man walks back in and taps the Texan on the shoulder. "Is the bet still good?" he asks. The Texan nods and asks the bartender to line up 10 pints of Guinness. Without missing a beat, the Irishman knocks them all back, one after another, to the cheers of the pub. The Texan hands him the $500, still in shock. "I gotta ask, where'd you go for those 30 minutes?" The Irishman grins and replies, "Oh, I just went down the street to the other pub to see if I could actually do it first." Two rednecks are out hunting when they come across a massive hole in the ground. They stare at it, impressed by its size. The first hunter says, "Wow, that's some hole. Can't even see the bottom. I wonder how deep it is." The second hunter replies, "I don't know. Let's throw something in and see how long it takes to hit bottom." The first hunter looks around and says, "There's an old gearbox over there. Let's throw that in." They haul it over, count to 3, and toss it in the hole. As they stand there listening for the sound of it hitting the bottom, they suddenly hear rustling behind them. They turn around to see a goat running full speed, charging right at the hole. Without missing a beat, the goat leaps head first into the hole. The two hunters stare at each other, then back into the hole, trying to figure out what just happened. An old farmer walks up, wiping his hands. "Say, fellas," he asks, "did you happen to see my goat around here?" The first hunter says, "Funny you should ask. Just a minute ago, a goat came flying out of the bushes, doing about 100 miles an hour, and jumped right into this hole." The farmer scratches his head and replies, "Well, that's impossible. I had him chained to that old gearbox." Frank and Fiona were having a passionate moment in Frank's van when Fiona, feeling adventurous after reading 50 Shades of Grey, yelled out, "Oh, fat boy, whip me, whip me!" Not wanting to miss out on this rare opportunity, Frank quickly scanned the van. No whips in sight, but then, in a flash of inspiration, he opened the window, snapped off the van's antenna, and used it to whip Fiona. They both collapsed into ecstatic bliss, basking in the aftermath. A week later, Fiona noticed the marks from their enthusiastic session weren't healing. In fact, they seemed to be getting worse. So she went to the doctor. After a quick glance at the wounds, the doctor asked, "Did you get these from sex?" Fiona, feeling a bit awkward about admitting to the whole kinky van session, hesitated before sheepishly replying, "Yes, I did." The doctor nodded knowingly and said, "Ah, I thought so. You've got the worst case of venereal disease I've ever seen." Mr. Ponsonby Smythe received an urgent phone call from his wife. "George, there's a gorilla in the apple tree in the front garden," she cried, panic in her voice. "A gorilla?" George repeated skeptically. "Are you sure? Have you been drinking again?" "No, George," she said. "It's real. It must have escaped from the zoo or a circus. It's sitting in the tree, growling at everyone, and just threw an apple at Mrs. Bell from number 23. "Did it hit her?" George asked, then added, "No, never mind. I'll be right home." George arrived to find, sure enough, a massive gorilla in the apple tree. As soon as the gorilla saw him, it growled and threw an apple at him, narrowly missing. He rushed inside where his wife was nervously peering through the curtains. "George, what do we do?" she asked, frantic. "Don't worry, Miriam," he said, picking up the yellow pages. "I'll find a professional." After a quick search, George found only one listing under gorilla catchers. He dialed the number, and after a few rings, a voice answered. "Bloggs and Wilson, gorilla catchers, Bloggs speaking." "Good afternoon," said George. "There's a gorilla in my apple tree. Can you come and catch it?" "I'm sorry, sir," Bloggs replied, "but Wilson is off sick today. We're short-handed." "But it's urgent," George protested. "The gorilla's in the tree causing a scene. I'm sure it's lowering property values. Surely there's something you can do." "Well," said Bloggs, "catching a gorilla is a two-man job, but if you're willing to fill in for Wilson, we can manage." "I'll do anything," George said, desperate. "Just tell me what to do." 20 minutes later, a battered transit van with the sign "Bloggs and Wilson Gorilla Catchers" pulled up. Bloggs got out, unloaded a large rifle, a set of manacles, and a snarling Rottweiler. He rang the doorbell and greeted George. "I see the gorilla's still up there," Bloggs said. "We'd better get started." "All right," George said. "What do I do?" "Simple," Bloggs replied. "You stand here with the manacles. I'll climb the tree, wrestle the gorilla down, and push him out. The moment he hits the ground, the dog will leap at his, sensitive parts, distracting him long enough for you to put the manacles on. Then we'll load him into the van." George nodded. "Got it. But what's the rifle for?" Bloggs leaned in, serious. If by any chance the gorilla knocks me out of the tree, you have to shoot the dog. An army squad is on exercise in the jungle, and the sergeant major gathers the lads for a briefing. "Listen up, lads," he warns. "The local women are incredibly seductive, but they carry diseases, so stay clear. Next," he continues, "the water's contaminated with the dreaded juju worm. Drink it, and you'll be in trouble. And finally, there's a snake so deadly you have to be extra cautious. It has black and yellow stripes, easy to spot. If you can't avoid it, grab its tail, run your hand up to its head, and give it a good whack. Off you go, lads." 2 weeks later, the sergeant major visits 3 soldiers in the hospital. "What happened to you, soldier?" he asks one, noticing a case of the pox. "Gorgeous local girl, Sarge. She seduced me, and now I've got this pox. You warned me, though." "Right," the sergeant major replies, shaking his head. "What about you?" The second soldier looks sheepish. "The water, Sarge. I was so thirsty, I drank it, and now I've got this worm eating at my bottom." The sergeant major groans, but turns to the third soldier, who's bandaged from head to toe. "And you? What happened?" The soldier winces and says, "The black and yellow snake, Sarge. I grabbed it by the tail, like you said, ran my hand up, and... well, turns out I wasn't dealing with the snake. I had my 2 fingers up the bottom of the biggest Bengal tiger you've ever seen." 3 new recruits in the Metro Police are taking their first test. The commander-in-chief shows them a profile picture of a suspect and asks, "Is there any feature in this guy's face that would help identify him as a criminal?" The first recruit squints at the picture and says, "He's got just one eye." "Are you kidding me?" the commander snaps. "It's a profile picture. Can't you see that?" The second recruit pipes up. "He's got just one ear." The commander sighs in frustration. "I've told you it's a profile shot, his left profile to be exact." The third recruit looks carefully, then says, "He's wearing contact lenses." The commander, impressed, asks, "Brilliant! How did you come to that conclusion from just a profile picture?" The recruit replies, "Well, how else could he keep his glasses on with only one eye and one ear?" A guy is driving alone through a remote part of the country on a rainy night. Suddenly, his car starts veering to one side. He pulls over, gets out, and inspects the car, flat tire. He grabs the equipment from the trunk: wheel, triangle, wrench, no jack. He checks the manual, which confirms the jack should be in the trunk, but it's nowhere to be found. What to do? He remembers seeing some houses a mile up the road and begins walking toward them. "What a night for a flat! Why does this always happen to me?" Walk, walk, walk. "By the time I get back, my car is probably going to be stolen." Walk, walk. "Probably no one's home. Why would they be? It's late and this weather's terrible." Walk, walk. "No, wait. They'll be home, but they won't answer the door. Why would they? Who wants to help a stranger in the middle of the night?" Walk, walk. "Maybe they're serial killers. Why else would they be awake at this hour?" Finally, he reaches the first house. He rings the bell. Inside, a dog starts barking like it's trying to wake the dead. Just my luck. If the dog doesn't tear me apart, the owner surely will. Getting people out of bed at this hour for a car jack? Do I look like a mechanic to you? Why don't you buy one in the daytime, like normal people? The barking continues, and then voices join in. Soaked and frustrated, the man waits, dreading the inevitable. "Bet he's getting a gun. I'll probably get shot in the face." "Well, officer, he did ask for a jack, but I thought it was a dumb excuse. Who needs a jack when every car comes with one?" The door finally creaks open. A frowning man peeks out and cautiously says, "Good evening. How?" The man cuts him off, exasperated. "Well, you know what? You can go to hell and take your damn car jack with you." Jimmy and Jack were twins, but not identical, far from it. Jimmy was skinny, while Jack was built like a bodybuilder. As a result, Jack effortlessly attracted women everywhere he went, while poor Jimmy struggled. Even when women did approach him, usually because he was standing next to Jack, he found it hard to talk to them. Despite their differences, the two were best friends, and Jack always tried to help Jimmy, though with little success. One day, they decided to hit the beach. Jack knew that as soon as he walked onto the sand in his swimming trunks, women would flock to him, and hopefully Jimmy would benefit from the overflow. But just as they were about to leave, something came up, and Jack had to handle some business first. "Head to the beach," Jack said to Jimmy. "I'll meet you there, but in the meantime, we need to give you a bit of an advantage. That skinny body is what's holding you back. We can't give you muscles, but we can make you look more macho. Get a potato and tuck it down your trunks. You'll look a lot more studly." Jimmy followed Jack's advice and set off. Later, Jack made his way to the beach and found his brother right away. The crowd was parted in a big circle around him, as if they were avoiding something unpleasant. At the center sat Jimmy, looking miserable. Jack approached him. "What's going on?" Jimmy sighed. "This is all your fault. I did what you said. I stuck the potato down my trunks, but as soon as I came out of the changing room, people started screaming and running away. You said this would attract the girls, but no one will come within 20 yards of me." Jack shook his head. "I'm not surprised. You were supposed to put the potato down the front of your trunks." Paddy O'Toole, the strongest man in Ireland, was walking home from the pub when he heard a voice calling out, "Help! Please help!" Paddy rushed over and saw a man stuck in the peat bog, with only his head and shoulders visible. "No problem," Paddy said confidently. "I'm Paddy O'Toole, the strongest man in Ireland, and I'll pull you out." He grabbed hold of the man and began to pull with all his might. Despite his efforts, the man remained firmly stuck. "I'll try again," Paddy grunted. He yanked and heaved, but after a couple of minutes, he stopped, exhausted. "It's no use," Paddy sighed. "I'm Paddy O'Toole, the strongest man in Ireland. If I can't get you out, nobody can. I'll have to go back to the village and get some help." As Paddy turned to leave, the man called out, "Paddy, wait! Before you go, do you think it would help if I took my feet out of the stirrups?" A young woman who had recently gotten married was visited by her best friend. The friend noticed that the woman was walking a bit differently and couldn't help but ask, "Wow, what happened to your walk? Did you twist your ankle or something?" The woman blushed and replied, "When you try to fit something larger into a much smaller space, you're bound to feel it the next day." On a flight from New York to Chicago, the flight attendant notices a man sitting in his seat, biting his nails and sweating profusely. Concerned, she approaches and asks, "Sir, can I get you something from the bar to help calm you down?" The man nods, trembling, and the flight attendant brings him a drink. He downs it quickly. 10 minutes later, she notices the same man, ashen-faced, still shaking and nervously biting his nails. She offers him another drink, which he swallows immediately. Half an hour later, she sees the man again, shaking uncontrollably, and now even crying. "My goodness," she says, "I've never seen anyone so terrified of flying." The man looks up, sobbing loudly. "I'm not afraid of flying," he replies. "I'm trying to give up drinking." A guy spent 5 years traveling the globe, filming native dances for a documentary. By the time he finished, he thought he'd captured every indigenous dance known to man, until he ended up in Alice Springs, Australia. After a long day of filming, he decided to pop into a local pub for a drink. He struck up a conversation with an Aboriginal man and mentioned his project. The Aboriginal man asked, "Did you film the butcher dance?" "The butcher dance?" the guy replied, confused. "What's that?" "You mean you don't know the butcher dance?" the Aboriginal man asked in disbelief. "No, never heard of it." "Mate, you're kidding me. How can you say you've filmed every native dance if you haven't seen the butcher dance?" "Well, I just filmed a corroboree last week." "Is that the one you're talking about?" No, the butcher dance is way more important than that." Intrigued, the guy asked, "Where can I see this butcher dance?" The Aboriginal man sighed. "Mate, it's far out in the wilderness. It'll take you days to get there. I've traveled everywhere, from the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic, filming these dances. Nothing's going to stop me now." The Aboriginal man nodded and gave him a set of directions. "Drive north for 197 miles, then take a dirt track left for 126 miles. You'll see a huge dead gum tree. Leave your car there. From there, walk west into the sunset for 3 days, then follow a creek northwest for another 2 days until you reach the Rocky Mountains. Cross them, Then head south for half a day until you find a pass through the mountains. After that, head northwest for 4 days until you find a big rock shaped like a man's head. From there, walk west for 2 more days, and you'll reach the village. That's where the butcher dance takes place. The guy, determined not to miss it, packed up his crew and set off. Hours turned into days as he crawled along rough tracks and trudged through the wilderness, finally reaching the village after nearly 2 weeks. Exhausted, he went to the village chief and said, "I'm here to film the butcher dance." The chief looked at him disappointed. "You're too late, mate. The butcher dance was last night." "Well, when's the next one?" "Not till next year." "Please," the man pleaded. "I've come all this way. Can't you hold an extra dance tonight?" The chief shook his head. "The butcher dance is sacred. It only happens once a year. Come back next year if you want to see it." Devastated, the man returned home, but a year later he was back in Australia, determined not to miss the dance again. He set out a week earlier, prepared for whatever hardships lay ahead. This time the weather fought against him. Rain bogged down the dirt tracks and they had to hike through mud. A crew member sprained his ankle, but after a grueling journey, they arrived in the village just in time. The chief smiled when he saw him. "You're just in time for the butcher dance tonight." Relieved, the crew set up their equipment. As the sun set, the villagers painted their bodies, donned feathers and animal skins, and gathered around a roaring fire. A wise elder entered the circle and began chanting. "What's he doing?" the man whispered. "Hush," the chief whispered back. "This is our most sacred ritual. The holy man is calling upon the spirits to watch over us and bless our dance." The chanting grew louder, and then the drums began to pound. The villagers started swaying to the rhythm, and the guy was swept up in the excitement, thinking he was about to witness the ultimate display of cultural devotion. The chief stepped into the circle, raised his voice, and began singing. "You butcher your right arm in, you butcher your right arm out, you butcher your right arm in, and you shake it all about." In the dead of night, a bootneck is driving from Plymouth to London and a para is driving from London to Plymouth. The roads are empty, and they collide head-on, both cars flying off in opposite directions. The bootneck, shaken but alive, climbs out of his car and looks around at the wreckage. He says to himself, "Man, I'm really lucky to be alive." The para does the same, surveying his destroyed car, and mutters, "I can't believe I survived this wreck." The bootneck, feeling philosophical, walks over to the para. "Hey man, I think this is a sign from God that we should put aside our differences and be friends instead of enemies." The para pauses, then nods. "You know what? You're absolutely right. We should be friends." Feeling a bit of camaraderie, the bootneck says, "Well, I'm going to see what else survived this wreck." He opens the boot of his car and pulls out an unopened bottle of Pusser's rum. "This," he declares, "is a sign from God that we should toast to our new friendship." The para grins, grabs the bottle, and starts drinking. He downs almost half before handing it back to the bootneck. "That was good. Your turn." The bootneck screws the cap back on and says, "Nah, I think I'll wait for the cops to arrive." 2 women head out for a night on the town without their husbands. After a bit too much to drink, they find themselves stumbling home. Deciding to take a shortcut through the cemetery, the chill and the alcohol hit them hard, and both women desperately need to use the toilet. With no one around, they squat behind a couple of gravestones and do their business before continuing on their way. The next day, the 2 women's husbands who work for the same company run into each other in the canteen. One turns to the other and says, "I think my wife's having an affair." The other, concerned, asks, "What makes you think that?" "Well," the first one replies, "when I woke up this morning, she was still asleep, face down in bed. I couldn't believe it when I saw a rose stuck in her backside." The second man shakes his head. "You think that's bad? When I woke up, my wife had a card stuck in her backside. It read, 'From all your friends at the fire station.'" A man is sitting on a plane, ready for takeoff, when another man with a dog sits next to him. The dog sits between them, and the first man is curious. The second man notices and says, Don't worry about Rover. He's a sniffer dog, the best there is. I'll show you once we're airborne. After the plane takes off and levels out, the handler turns to the man and says, "Watch this." He commands the dog, "Rover, search." The dog jumps down, walks along the aisle, and sits next to a woman for a few seconds before returning to its seat and placing one paw on the handler's arm. "Good boy," the handler says, then turns to the first man. "That woman is carrying marijuana, so I'll make a note of her seat number to hand over to the authorities when we land." "Wow, that's impressive," replies the first man. The handler sends Rover out again. The dog sniffs around, sits beside a man for a moment, then returns to the handler and places both paws on his arm. "That man is carrying cocaine," says the handler. "Noted his seat number as well." The first man is amazed. "This is incredible." The handler sends the dog out again. Rover moves up and down the aisle, sniffing at various passengers. Eventually, the dog sits next to someone, then runs back, jumps into the seat, and to the first man's shock, starts to poop everywhere. The first man is horrified and asks, "What's going on?" The handler, looking very nervous, says, "He just found a bomb." The couple had 2 young boys, ages 8 and 10, who were always up to mischief. If anything troublesome happened in town, their parents were certain their sons were behind it. One day, the boy's mother heard about a clergyman in town who was known for disciplining children, so she asked if he could speak to her sons. The clergyman agreed, but requested to see them separately. So the mother sent her 8-year-old first, with the older boy scheduled for the afternoon. The clergyman, a tall man with a booming voice, sat the younger boy down and asked, "Where is God?" The boy froze, wide-eyed and speechless. The clergyman repeated the question, his tone growing firmer. "Where is God?" The boy still said nothing. Now, getting serious, the clergyman raised his voice and shook a finger in the boy's face, shouting, "Where is God?" The boy screamed in terror and dashed out of the room, running straight home and hiding in his wardrobe. His older brother found him a few minutes later, breathless and wide-eyed. "What happened?" the older brother asked. Gasping, the younger brother whispered, "We're in big trouble. God's missing, and they think we did it." Jock is in a serious bind. His business has failed, and he's drowning in debt. Desperate, he decides to turn to God for help. "God, please, I've lost my shop, and if I don't get some money, I'll lose my house too. Please, let me win the lottery." The lottery comes, but someone else wins. Jock prays again. "God, please, let me win the lottery. I've lost my shop, my house, and now I'm about to lose my car as well." Lottery night rolls around. No luck again. Determined, Jock prays one more time. "God, I've lost my business, my home, my car. My kids are starving. I don't often ask you for help, and I've always tried to be a good servant. Please, just let me win the lottery this one time so I can get back on my feet." Suddenly, there's a brilliant flash of light, the heavens open, and the voice of God booms down. "Jock, at least meet me halfway and buy a ticket." An attorney arrived home late after a tough day. He had been trying to get a stay of execution for a client who was scheduled to be hanged at midnight. Despite his best efforts, his plea to the governor for clemency had been denied, and he was feeling utterly defeated. As soon as he stepped through the door, his wife immediately launched into her usual routine. "What time do you call this? Where have you been? Dinner's cold and I'm not reheating it." The complaints went on and on. Too exhausted to respond, he poured himself a shot of whiskey and headed for a long, hot bath, with her sarcastic remarks trailing behind him. While he was soaking in the tub, the phone rang. His wife answered, and the caller informed her that her husband's client, James Wright, had been granted a stay of execution. Wright would not be hanged that night. Realizing how terrible his day must have been, she rushed upstairs to share the good news. As she opened the bathroom door, she was met with the sight of her husband bent over, naked, drying his legs and feet. "They're not hanging Wright tonight," she said, to which he spun around and screamed, "For the love of God, woman, can't you ever just let me have a moment's peace?" A social worker, recently transferred to a remote rural area, was on her first tour of her new territory when she came upon the smallest cabin she'd ever seen. Curious, she approached and knocked on the door. "Anybody home?" she asked. "Yep," came a kid's voice from inside. "Is your father there?" asked the social worker. "Pa? Nope. He left before Ma came in, the kid replied. Is your mother there? She asked again. Ma? Nope, she left just before I got here, the kid answered. Thinking she had found her first violation, the social worker pressed on. But don't you ever all come together as a family? Oh, sure, but not here, said the kid. This is the toilet.